Do you ever have a moment when something happens and it instantly transports you back to your childhood? I had that this morning when I picked up a hymnal. Because when I was like 50 years ago, when we were just young kids, a number of us cut a deal with our parents that we didn't have to sit with them. We could sit together away from our parents. But the deal was we had to sit in the second row where they could see us. We thought we were quite clever because we had this little game that every time a hymn was announced, everyone would take a hymnal and open it and see if they could open it on exactly that page. We got pretty good, and we thought no one noticed. Until one day on the way home, my dad said, "What was that when so-and-so did this?" So I will confess that after every song, I closed the book and saw what I could do this morning. I've clearly lost my touch. Many of us started watching the Olympic Games this weekend. And when it's all over, 2 weeks from now, we'll be able to see highlight packages of those games. And those packages will summarize the 2+ weeks of frenzied sporting and cultural events, and they'll compact them into an hour or two. Our Daniel series is based on the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and it's pretty easy to think about that block of stories as a highlight package, a rapid recap of all the things that have gone on. In fact, to prepare for today, I listened to the first 6 chapters of Daniel on an audiobook while I was driving in my car. Didn't take very long. And those 6 stories came in, one piled on top of the other, kind of like a highlight package. Just like if you sit down and read them back to back to back, the stories come piling in and it feels like they're really close together. An action-packed recap of what might have happened over a couple of frenzied weeks. You know, first Daniel and his friends get hauled into the king's court, and then things get worse, weird dreams by the king, threats from the king, the fiery furnace, the king goes mad. Then in today's story, there's a funny handwriting situation, and next week, there's the lion's den. And when you read it quickly, it can sound like an intense and rough couple of weeks for Daniel and the boys. And while the stories are indeed intense, we miss a lot of the meaning if we hold the misconception that they happened packed together in a short period of time. In fact, those stories take place over a period of 70 or 80 years. Daniel's probably 16 or 18 when he's pressed into the service in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. He was just a high school student when he said, "No, I'm not going to eat that food." He was in his early 20s, like a CNCer, when the king called him in and said, "You need to tell me what my dream was and what it means, or all of these wise men die." And by the time we get to today's story, Daniel is in his 70s, a member of the seniors coffee group. In many ways, today's story is a culmination of that long period of time. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are much less a highlight package, and they're much more like a tribute that you would see when you celebrate a person's career or their retirement, or you pay tribute to a life well lived. How do you summarize 40 or 50 or 60 years in 20 minutes or less? For sure you pick the highlights, but you can't create a complete recap. You intentionally pick stories and pictures and episodes that reflect the essence of that long period that's being remembered. It's about reflection, and the reflection is about the choices that are prompted, and that's what lies at the heart of today's lessons from Daniel chapter 5. So before we look at today's story, a bit of a recap on a couple of points from the earlier weeks that we looked at Daniel. This book is about a time when the people of Israel are in exile. They were expelled from their homeland. They were forced to trek to Babylon to serve that king and his people. It was foreign, it was unknown, it was frightening. They were in a place they didn't want to be, They could not go back. There was no going home. And in addition to being far from home, they were in a very volatile political period. After they were taken over and moved by the Babylonians, they had to survive the next 70 years, where there were 4 or 5 successive kings who became increasingly dysfunctional, only to be overthrown by the Persians after that. The 70-year period began early in Daniel's life and ends in today's story. Not only were they in exile, away from home, they were in an unstable and unpredictable place. And today's story happens at the end of that period. It's a story in which Daniel calls us to reflect on what we're seeing today in light of what he has learned and experienced up to that time over his 80 years. And then, after reflection, Daniel calls for some choices to be made. So in the outline of this series, this episode is called God versus King, Part 3. Part 1 is from Daniel 2, where the king calls on his wise men to tell him the dream that he had, and then to interpret it. Nobody can do so except Daniel, who says what God laid on his heart, including the difficult message that the king's kingdom would be torn down. In part 2 of God versus King, which is Daniel chapter 4, the king asks for another of his dreams to be interpreted, this time about a giant tree that gets cut down and chopped up. And again, Daniel does so, revealing the king's pride and foretelling that he will go mad, that he will lose his authority. In fact, he'll lose all of his competence unless he acknowledges that his authority comes from God. And the king is unable to relinquish his pride, and he loses his kingdom for a period of time until it is restored, when he attributes all of the power and authority he has to Daniel's God, the one true God. So today, in Daniel 5, the story that was just read, we have a new king for today's episode of God versus King. So what's the situation? Well, the king's in a bit of a tough spot. Invasion of his kingdom by the Persians is imminent. So what does he do? Does he do what a responsible monarch would do, planning for the protection of his people and planning for a way to outfox the adversary? No. He presumed that he's above it all. He throws a big party, diverting attention away from the impending doom. For the party, he asks that the dishes that were seized from the temple decades ago, when Israel fell to Babylon, he asks that they be brought out of storage. And those dishes which were part of the temple are now being used at a party where all manner of gods are being praised. And that one evening, the king was desecrating what was holy. He was pretending he could uphold his empire, and he was offering empty security to his people. And then, to his horror, the king sees a human hand writing on the wall. No person, no body, just a hand writing a message. And of course, he wants to know what it means. So he offers great riches to anyone who can interpret it. And like the previous King versus God episodes, guess what? Nobody can. Maybe they don't know, maybe it's not possible, or maybe they're just afraid. And then the queen comes to the rescue. She goes back in her memory banks and she says, in the past when this happened, there was this Daniel guy. He was special. He has unique gifts of wisdom. I'm pretty sure he can explain it. So think about that irony. Here's the all-powerful king with all of the resources at the entire kingdom at his disposal, yet he calls what seems to be the most unlikely candidate, an 80-year-old exile from Judah, whose God was being dishonored by the sacrilegious behavior going on in that room. And not only does he call Daniel, but he offers him great riches if he can reveal the meaning of the dream. And so Daniel speaks. First, he rejects the king's premise that he needs riches to do as asked. He will do it just because it's the right thing to do. Next, Daniel does a bit of a history lesson. He reflects on the Babylonian kings of the past number of decades. His history lesson has a theme. The king's predecessors suffered great loss, great upheaval, great indignity, until they acknowledged God's sovereignty. So Daniel says it straight up. Things go better for the king when he declares that his blessings and authority come from the one true God. Then, Daniel's choice to be faithful puts him in a rather awkward spot because he needs to deliver a stinging indictment to the king, as if to say, like you might to a small child, you haven't learned a thing. You're letting your pride set the agenda. You insult God with your sacrilege. You provide no honor, no glory to God. It's all about you. Think about your predecessors. Think about the past episodes of King versus God. You haven't learned a thing. And then finally, Daniel tells him what the handwriting on the wall means. He says, that handwriting is from God. You are a disappointing king, the last in a line of increasingly worse rulers. You have fallen short of what God requires of you, so you will lose your kingdom, not to a successor, but to the enemy. And then the story concludes with a short summary of what happened next. The king, grateful for the interpretation, rewarded Daniel and made him the third highest ranking person in the empire. And that very night, the king was killed, and the kingdom was overtaken by the Persians under the leadership of Darius. And history will show that the Persians ruled Babylon for the next 200 years. The Persian king, recognizing Daniel's ability, gave him vast responsibility for running the kingdom. And under the Persians, the exiled people were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The message in the handwriting on the wall was fulfilled. So what do we do with that ancient story? How do we find some currency in that story from so long ago? And I think the answer lies in reflection and in choices. First, let's reflect. The world in Daniel 5 is a lot like our own. Israel was in exile. No going back to what was comfortable, fading memories of better times, prevailing attitudes in society that didn't line up with their beliefs, a string of ineffective leaders who turned their back on the lessons of history. Does any of that sound familiar? And then let's look at the two main characters, starting with the king. The king was preoccupied with himself in the face of a dire threat of war. In that situation, he chooses to throw a party, ignoring the facts, having fun, and letting himself off the hook for what he's expected to be doing. It's almost like he believes that he can wish the future into being what he wants it to be. And like his predecessors, his decisions flow from pride and complacency of his privileged position. The king is thinking about today. And he assumes everyone is as preoccupied with advancing themselves as he is. His best solution to get people to reveal the meaning of his dreams is to promise them riches if they do it. In his mind, money and self-preservation are the answer to life's problems. And then, even after Daniel gives them the direct warning, the warning that says, you have not honored God, in whose power is your very breath, and to whom belong all of your ways. Even after being given that warning, he still goes his own way. And as a result, the most powerful man in the land, goes down to defeat and to his death within hours of that dream being revealed. The king versus God episode is different this time, but the ending is the same. The king's pride wins out, and his choice to rely on himself leads to his demise. Now let's think about Daniel. Daniel's been in exile, serving a foreign power for all of his adult life. He's conducted himself differently from those with whom he's living. He hearkens back to what he knows. He's not preoccupied with today's situation. He leans on a long-term, considered perspective that draws on all that he knows and all that he's learned and all that he's experienced. And that reflection anchors him in the foundational truth that God is sovereign. God is good. God is faithful. And no matter how dire this moment might look, Daniel trusts God, staying true to him, even though other actions might seem better for him. He conducts himself without reproach. He doesn't stoop to pettiness. He pursues God's good, not his own ambition. He's admired by the Babylonians. He lived this way as a youth. He lives this way in each of the 3 episodes with the series of kings over 60 years. And as we will see next week, he even does it under the new leadership of the Persians when he's faced with the prospect of being tossed into the lion's den. For Daniel, his reflection on the experiences and lessons of the past about God's faithfulness, they fill him with confidence. He doesn't know what's going to happen next, but he is 100% confident on how the story will end. God will be sovereign. Those that are faithful will be blessed and rewarded. And those that have been self-centered, unfaithful, or hostile to God, they will be judged. So we've reflected on the circumstances. We've reflected on the characters in the story. What kind of choices are there to be made? I think the first choice is about who we might choose to model ourselves after. You might be tempted to think when looking at Daniel and the king that this is a choice about whether to live in the kingdom, like the king did, or to live outside the kingdom, like we might think Daniel did. But I don't think that's the case. It seems to me that both the king and Daniel were in the mainstream of the Babylonian world. The king was obviously the ruler, but Daniel was not an outsider who lived apart from the Babylonians. As a youth, he was in the king's court. As a young man, he was among the king's wise men. He was appointed to very senior positions in the Babylonian hierarchy. Seems to me that Daniel was integrated into the world in which he was an exile. So if he and the king were both integrated into the Babylonian world, how did Daniel differ from the king in his approach to life? I saw 5 things, quickly. The first is, where do they look for their guiding light? Daniel lived by the eternal truth that he had seen and that he had been taught, and which he knew from experience was right. The king, on the other hand, lived for today, doing what he felt was the right thing for him and the right thing to advance his own interests. The king did not learn from reflection. A second difference is who serves who. For Daniel, God has authority over all earthly powers. There is no power that is beyond God's control and judgment, and we all serve him. The king acted as though all that authority belonged to him, and he was the one who ought to be served. A third difference is how they have respect for what is divine and what is not. Daniel respected that which was sacred and attributed divine power only to God. The king was sacrilegious, disrespecting that which was of God, using it in self-serving ways, and offering praise to all manner of gods. A fourth difference is their decision whether or not to follow God. Daniel stood firm in his faith and testified for God with boldness, emphasizing how real God is and how severe his judgment can be. The king simply ignored God. And the fifth difference, as I saw, is knowing who writes the story. Daniel lived with the confidence that in the end, God will prevail. Daniel knows how the story will end, even if the events in the short term are not what he would personally prefer. Even if he doesn't know where they're going, Daniel knows how the story will end. Even facing threats to his life, he trusts God to use the situation to turn things in God's direction. The king thought he would get to write the story. So beyond that choice of who we model ourselves after, what other choices must we make each day? For me, some of them are, who do we rely on? How do we keep from becoming so reliant on ourselves that we leave God out of our thinking, believing that we have all the resources we need to figure out the answers ourselves? Another choice is how we reflect God. How do we act faithfully so that those who do not share our faith respect and reflect our belief? How do we act faithfully so that those who do not share our faith perspective, how do we act so that they respect our beliefs and our contributions as they did Daniel's? And another choice that we have is, how much confidence will we have that God is writing the story? Will we trust in God's ultimate sovereignty when confronted with decisions where the faithful answer might personally hurt us in the short term? Daniel had a long faithfulness, grounded in reflection on a long history of spiritual reality. His reflection led him to a firm faith, a faith that he boldly explained. He was strong and tactful in calling out unfaithfulness, and he was 100% confident in God's sovereignty. Like the king, we will all be measured. Will we be found faithful, as Daniel was, or will we, like the king, be found wanting? That's the biggest choice that we each get to make every day.